Good day. My name is Thomas Ritchie, founder of Ritchie Stores, and I suppose you'd like to hear how lucky I was to lay the foundations of a 150-year legacy. Or perhaps you'd like to learn what stroke of fortune did I encounter in order to establish the most prominent independent supermarket chain in the nation. And perhaps you seek the answers as to how privileged was my upbringing, how wealthy was my family, or how connected we were to the local movers and shakers of the time. Well, throughout the course of this video, I'm afraid that you will learn none of the aforementioned articles, for that would make for a terribly boring tale to tell. The truth is, there was no such privilege, wealth, or connection. Perhaps a dusting of luck, but not in ways that you would expect. You see, I even lost my father from the age of 3, and from there it befell my mother and 10 siblings the responsibility of shaping my formative years. Consider this, and perhaps throughout the course of this video, you'll find similarities as to how I was raised and to how I run business. For the next 15 years we lived in Scotland and the Isle of Man, enduring events that would later be referred to as the Hungry 40s, the Great Famine, and the dreaded Black 47. Famines that produced excess mortality across Northern Europe, the Scottish Highlands, and rather infamously through Ireland. So life indeed was rather miserable for us in the Highlands until word of the 1850s gold rush in Victoria reached our ears. So as a young bachelor, I put together all I could and invested in 2 major assets. First, a ticket to Melbourne aboard a ship named the Isabella Watson, and second, a crate filled with boots which I intended to sell to the miners on the goldfields. We set sail from London in November 1851. In order to secure safe passage, I did not tell the skipper that I was an 18-year-old Scotsman, but a 20-year-old Englishman. Now this voyage would take us 117 days, and the conditions were recorded as very favourable, until our final pass through Port Phillip Heads, when a sudden gust of wind would turn about the Isabella Watson and impale her upon a rocky outcrop of stone now known as Corsair Rock. There were approximately 77 aboard this vessel, yet the captain's gig could only accommodate 8, as it was lowered into the sea, carrying with it a handful of crew, passengers, and the only child to sail with us. I later understand that vessel did safely make it to shore. However, in the growing darkness and the rising storms, we were only left to pray for their safety. And though many of us tried to stay below the decks, a handful of passengers then implored the captain to lower the life raft. I watched as he planted himself between the life raft and the Isabella Watson to load 11 passengers aboard. He was swept overboard 3 times in his duties. But just as he was about to launch the smaller craft, the Isabella Watson's mizzenmast broke, crashing through and overturning the smaller vessel. 2 passengers were saved, whilst the other 9 were lost to the sea. Cold and afeared, we remained below the decks until dawn finally broke. It was then that the ship's pilot tied a rope around his waist and boldly made an attempt to swim to shore. He was successful, and with that rope the remaining 60 or so passengers were able to shimmy along that line for safety, whereas I myself was swept off that line. Instead, I clung to a piece of floating debris and paddled my way in, thus making my first steps on Australian soil with only the clothes upon my back. My shipment of boots, sadly, were never recovered. Considering this is now 1852, there is very little in the means of compensation or support. I had to fend for myself. I took to logging, labouring, and trying my luck on the Bendigo goldfields before I would then welcome my mother, my 2 sisters, and my brother James to these shores. The following year, in '53, James and I would establish a grocery store in Gardiner's Creek, now known as Malvern. And though trade and commerce were soon to become iconic roles in my life, I would not establish the company that you know and love for another 17 years. But it is those interval years that played a very significant role in my life. In 1856, I met the love of my life, Margaret Kennedy. And soon after our marriage, Maggie and I would buy 4 acres of land in Oliver's Hill, Frankston, at the princely sum of £29. We built a home, and we started a family. First we had Colin, followed by Thomas Jr., Mary, Janet, William Kennedy, and finally Margaret Rose Ritchie. Unfortunately, we lost young Mary at 11 months, and then later my brother James at 35 years. But that would not be the only tragedy to befall my family. The year is 1863, a windy winter morning. I was away on a work site in Mount Eliza, and my wife Margaret was in the kitchen, where she looked out the window and noticed that the dairy cow was missing. Now, considering that milk is a vital resource for a growing family, it was imperative that she seek and retrieve it. So upon leaving the home, she bid our now 6-year-old son Colin the task to light the fire and boil the kettle, and our 5-year-old Thomas Jr. the task of keeping the fowls out of the kitchen and watching baby Margaret Rose. And off she went. 15 minutes later, my neighbour William noticed the smoke that was billowing over the hill that obscured our family homes. My wife Margaret was still out searching for the dairy cow. By the time he could respond, the roof had just collapsed, and baby Rose was found not 10 feet from the veranda, screaming and covered in burns. More neighbours arrived, and yet all they could do was stand and watch as my entire home was consumed by flames. Only when the fires had subsided could they determine what had happened. They found the body of my eldest son, Colin, kneeling over the bed, fruitlessly attempting to shield his siblings. The authorities concluded that he managed to take baby Rose out of the house before racing back inside to save his brothers and sister. The heat and the collapsing roof had trapped them all inside. My wife was questioned about this the very next morning, and word had only just reached me in Mount Eliza. Now, the community of Frankston numbered barely 100 people, yet they banded together to support Maggie, Rose, and myself. We were informed that benevolent members of the community had left lists of goods for us at the local bank, including a place to stay whilst our home was being rebuilt. Ordinarily, anyone who would suffer from such a tragic event would be drawn to leave the space of their trauma, to begin life anew and forget the past. But the hope, relief, and charity given unto us by the good people of Frankston was truly humbling and left us morally indebted to the area. So here we would stay, determined to give back to the people who gave so much to us. The following years, we would welcome Mary, Janet, Jessie, Thomas Jr. and Florence into our family, with some of the children sharing the names of their late siblings, whereas I will continue to work with and for the community, giving back a penny for every pound earned. This would rapidly accumulate as I eventually sat as a chairman of 2 gold mining companies, and later in 1867, my colleagues and I would found the Frankston Fish Company. Now, this was a cartage business that employed the local riders, weavers, merchants and salesmen to haul fish from Port Phillip Bay and cart it overnight to the old fish markets in Flinders Street. We could haul up to 12 tons of fish a week, and at our peak before the Depression struck us in the 1890s, we would turn over £20,000 a year, the modern equivalent of $4.46 million, an absolutely staggering figure at the time. Now, though a successful venture may be enough to settle most men, I would keep my eyes on the horizon. And come in 1870, a packet of land was bought in the heart of Frankston, and erected there was the first Ritchies General Store. Upon entering my store, you'd be met with the pleasant aromas of tobacco and spices. We blended this with sawdust and laid it out on the floor. This was an old technique I picked up in the fish markets to subconsciously lure the customer away from the more odorous merchants. And we sold everything in bulk, by box, by bag and packing case. Barrels that were packed full of tea, butter, tobacco and nails would serve as convenient display bins after we cracked them open. And here I would stand at a high polished counter with a pencil tucked behind my ear, ready to weigh and measure your goods, and then wrap it up in newspaper or tie it off with string, or simply place it back in the baskets our customers brought from home. In fact, soon after we were established, Australia began to receive machinery that would make paper bags. But as they were considered rare, if not novel, we reserved them for the more special goods. And there were few limits to what we could stock in the 19th century. We kept medicine, soap, starch, pickled and preserved goods, fresh and tinned food, feed and harnesses for the horses, as well as stocks of kerosene that were rapidly replacing the use of whale oil. We kept calico, flannel. My wife Margaret made shepherd's smocks for purchase. eggs were bought from the locals and sold individually. Flour, loose and scooped from great bins, cheese cut from huge wheels, home-cured bacon sliced off the slab, and fabric sold by the yard. And I am proud to see that certain sweets have stood the test of time, for we also stocked the likes of butterscotch and barley sugar. We stored these in large jars that were doled out to child and adult alike. Household goods and hardware items of all descriptions were kept at the back of the store, and in 1873, to the joy of our community, we acquired our liquor license. So as you could tell, there was no such thing as a quick trip to the grocery store. This was the focus point of neighborhood life, the hub of a burgeoning community. And as we and our community continued to develop and grow, I would later establish a separate store for corn and grain. It would operate as somewhat of a service station for the horse-drawn vehicles of the time. These years, however, were not without their own hardships. We lost Jessie at the age of 1, and later my mother Janet at 80. Robert Connell, the man who married my eldest daughter Rose, passed on, leaving her in the care of their 4 children, 3 of whom tragically passed within the next 3 years. I myself was involved in a railway accident, and the misfortune was not about to end there, for the great crash of the 1890s struck us. We were forced to sacrifice lands, shares and interests in the many operations that brought Frankston out of obscurity. The fish company suffered, as well as the Frankston Brick Company, of which I was once a major shareholder. My son, Thomas Jr., was declared insolvent or bankrupt, and later in 1901, I too was stretched too thin in the economic turmoil and declared insolvency. The 1907 Mornington Standard would describe my situation that he was mixed up in the land boom and also in the land collapse, and his properties and other interests had to be sacrificed. But as a family and as a community, we stuck together and endured. So after he received his letter of discharge from the banks, we gave Thomas Jr. a job alongside myself in the grain store, and despite his earlier hardships, he would later rise to a position in the local council as a reputable member with strong community focus. The business and the properties were now in the hands of my daughters, Janet and Florence, whilst Rose took over another operation of ours known as the Coffee Palace. In fact, I should state that young Florence was absolutely critical in bringing this company through the Depression, with a firm stance on cash-only operations and aggressive marketing strategies. She also implemented a very curious new system involving coupons. Now, this system was to devise a form of savings of which our community could benefit, and in some form, it still continues to this day. Now, she did not call it the Community Benefits Award. Instead, she called it the Popular Cash Cooperative Coupon System, a title I fear would fall short if it were pitched to the modern-day marketer. All the while, my beloved wife Margaret had been working arduously for the community over the previous decades. She was often considered one of the leading ladies of the place, from the introduction of the first Wesleyan church minister to the construction of the local Mechanics Institute. You see, this drive to support and nurture our communities was inherited by our children, who would go on to establish parks, churches, quadrille clubs, and Janet's particular talent in real estate brought so many new people to the area that she was hailed as the Queen of Long Island. These achievements were beyond my time, for my beloved wife Margaret and I would depart in 1907 within a month of one another. Margaret Rose, our eldest daughter and sole survivor of that horrific house fire, would inherit the business. But it is a tribute to her efforts that I'm able to stand before you today. But not just hers. You see, the Ritchies stores have seen continual success through a number of talented and community-minded individuals, from the Tomasetti family to Nelson Morris, through to the Cameron family, starting with Barry and Liz, and continuing through their sons Malcolm and James. The community-minded focus and legacy within Ritchies has seen itself ingrained into every neighbourhood where we open a new Ritchies store. And in continuing with my original creed of giving a penny for every pound, as of February 2020, the Ritchies stores have raised over $50 million to selected charities. So after 150 years, it truly makes me proud to say that we are and will always be Ritchies. where the community does indeed benefit. Thank you.